Today's video, how to repot your orchid like a pro. And this is Caroline'sOrchids.com here on Facebook and YouTube. We're going to be working with an orchid pot that we made some time ago. We make these, and there's a video on Caroline'sOrchids.com/videos and on YouTube and Facebook on how to make these. We use some sphagnum moss, nice and soaked, as well as spag moss that we love to use. We get this off Amazon, and we're going to link you to Amazon and eBay, plus this handy dandy air sprayer that's nice and light. We're going to be using all these different tools, and we're going to be showing you how to repot your orchid like a pro. This is very basic, and we're going to be working with an orchid similar to what we did in our last video where we unpacked our orchids. And Blackjack the cat agrees. So the first thing we do is we take our orchid, it's been drying, and this is the last video we showed you how we were going to go ahead and clip all of the yucky joints, the ones that were kind of getting rotted after it was being packed in its prison of sphagnum moss from the commercial orchid farm. We clip those off and we let it sit and dry, and here is why. First things first, let's make this a little wet and moist. It looks very dry and tender, but it's okay. It's completely healthy. Orchids hold water for longer than you might think. But you're going to notice something. And what you're going to notice here is that there are some skinny little parts to this root system, and there's some big thick ones. So let's soak it up. Let's take a look at what these roots look like once we get a little moisture on them. And we're going to clip off, lastly, some little parts that we couldn't clip before. It's interesting because just like a body part that doesn't get enough blood flow, these, on a human being, these little roots will start to kind of atrophy, and you'll know what to clip once you look. See how thin this is? It's like a little twig, and how fat that is? We clip. And don't worry, this doesn't hurt the plant, but where it stops being fat and it starts being super skinny, we have to clip. We're going to clip a few times, and the reason we're going to do it is because these are essentially parts that didn't survive the last clipping. They dried out, and they're not doing anything for this plant right now. And you can see where those are by just basically where there's an obvious change. They look very stringy and hairy, like almost like hairs, and then suddenly they're nice and thick and plump. So just clip where those joints are. Soak and wet as you go, and make sure that you're not leaving excess water. We'll talk about that in a minute. We're going to pull out any other little debris that might be in there, and we're going to make sure that this root system is very happy. See how thick, happy, yellowish, and greenish those are. Now back to our homemade pot. I hope you guys take us up on this project. And you're going to see the sphagnum moss soaking, and we're going to put it into the bottom of the homemade pot. The first step is kind of important because look, we're going to compress it. Not as much as what you uncompressed when you unpacked your orchid in the last video, but we're going to tamp it down a little bit to form like a base. And I want to point out too, when you take a look here, see how we have holes, and our holes only go up maybe a third of the way? Well, some people, this is personal preference, like to put their holes all the way up to the top to aerate it. We're going to put ours in the bottom. There's a good reason for this. Basically, the more holes you have in that pot, the more aeration it gets, the more often you'll have to water it. That we're in a very, very dry climate, I'm not going to want to water as much as maybe somebody who's in a climate where it's, moist and they don't worry about things drying out as much. So I'm going to want to water less, so I'm only putting in 1/3 of the holes. We're going to then take our plant, and this is really clever. Now, you guys know orchids, I'm going to have this sit, and every orchid ever is heavy on one side. Now you can see our roots, they kind of sit like feet on the bottom of the base that we formed. Aha, it's all coming together now, isn't it? So we're making sure that those roots sit and are not crushed down, but they just sit nicely on the bottom of the base of sphagnum moss. And you're going to notice this orchid wants to tilt to the side. Orchids, of course, folks, will grow to one way towards the sun, and you can't really get around it unless you rotate them, but they're always going to want to fall into one direction. You can notice that this little handle we made, this is not dead center, and there's another reason for that too. When the orchid sits and it wants to lean to one side, we pick it up, the whole container leans to one side, and then we control how much sunlight it gets based on how we tilt it towards our light source. And that's what we're going to do. Now, orchids, of course, epiphytes, grow on trees. Let's simulate a tree branch. I'm going to take this sphagnum moss and I'm going to squeeze it. And I'm going to squeeze almost all the water out of this. Remember, the bottom is very wet. This is not so much. And I am going to basically place it inside of that root system. Now I'm being very gentle with the roots. You know, I'm not going to break any roots, but I'm going to go ahead and place this. And again, orchids in the wild would grow on a tree branch. And I'll get a picture of that in a second. And on the tree branch, it's going to wrap itself around the tree branch. And we're going to kind of simulate that right here. Make it feel like it's at home. And you notice I'm packing a little tight at first inside, and then on the outside I'm a lot looser. There's an orchid on a tree branch to give you an idea of the way those roots wrap around. Well, I'm going to kind of simulate that here, although it's not going to be hanging obviously. I'm going to be putting this back into the plastic container. Nice and loose on the outside and tight on the inside. The tightness on the inside helps it to retain moisture. The looseness on the outside makes sure that my roots are happy, not being crushed, especially because the next thing I do is I have to put this back into my pot. Remember, the orchid leans to one side. Try to line that up the best you can, and just kind of gently kind of tap it in a little bit, making sure that it's happy, not crushed too much. And we're just going to slide it in. Eventually everything's going to fit. The sphagnum moss is very, very fluffy. It's kind of like if you're using some kind of, well, it's organic tissue, so it makes sense. And it holds a lot of water. We're going to weigh this in a minute and show you how heavy these things end up being after the first pot. So you're going to just take some more sphagnum because we're a little bit short. It doesn't have to soak forever. It does help if it's soaking for a long time. I'm going to mix some more moss up in my water, and I'm going to then take my handy dandy chopstick tool. Chopsticks, not just for sushi, sashimi, and rice anymore. And we're going to take the fat end, not the skinny end. There's a difference in fat and skinny. And I'm going to use the fat end, and I'm going to kind of poke down and get rid of all of those spots inside that are holding air. And you can see the root system is generally sitting on top, and that's important too. These are air roots after all. I want to make sure they do have some air to breathe. And I'm going to slowly and surely watch that I'm not hitting any roots, and I am going to push down that sphagnum moss. And this is perfect because it allows me more room for moss. I'm going to put some more in, tamp it down a little bit, and I'm going to follow this procedure all the way around the outside of the orchid, and making sure that I'm leaving plenty of room for it to breathe, but not so much that it's going to shift, fall around, or kind of fall out. And I'm sure you've all experienced commercial orchids that fall out. And one last thing I want to note here as I'm tamping down and showing you guys is, have you noticed I'm not using any bark? Yes, that's right. We found out, Caroline and I, that basically not using bark is working better for our orchids. They seem to take well to just the sphagnum moss, so we're showing you how to do this with just sphagnum moss. You could try bark if you wanted to. Some people like it. It can be more airy. Again, with the humidity that we have here, this works well for us. But experiment if you'd like. Don't use your favorite orchid in the whole wide world to experiment, and always do things that you think they're going to survive, because orchids deserve love and they're living too. You can see how I'm going around. I'm filling in the top a little bit, making sure again that those roots have room to breathe and grow and thrive. And there's another thing we're going to point out here in just a second, and it's going to be the room that we have between the top of the actual roots and the crown and the stem. Because we don't want to lead these plants to get crown rot, which everybody knows about, and stem rot, which less people know about. We want to make sure there's enough space. We do roses just on the outside, and roses are the same way. You don't want to suffocate the stalk of a rose. You want to make sure they have lots of room to breathe and grow. So in this case, the same thing. Make sure that your sphagnum moss is not encroaching on the stem, and make sure also that you get all the water out of the crown and the stem area, so we don't have any kind of crown rot or stem rot. You use a Q-tip for this if you want. That's what we use, and it's perfect. Now you look how that hangs and it tilts to one side, and that is really what it's all about there. We're going to be showing you this, basically how heavy this is in a second here, but you'll notice when it's hanging, it's naturally hanging in one way. So if I want it to face the window, it's easy to face the window. I just turn it that way. If I want it to face away, I face the way away from the window. And it helps you control the light and where it's getting light from, which is great. And you'll notice, guys, that moss doesn't have any kind of holes in it. There's no big pockets of air. And you'll notice also that it's easy and squishy to push down, but it's not compressed to heck, which is what happens when you get these things. In my last video that you saw us do, you'll notice how incredibly packed tight it is. It's a nice uniform color. There's lots of room for it to breathe and grow, but enough that it's going to stay nice and moist for us. So nice and heavy too. We're going to show you the weight of this thing in a second. Now this is with water and moss and plants and everything. Is a whopping nearly 700 grams, which is something in kilograms, almost a seventh of a kilogram. 24.3 ounces. This is means that this is about 1 3/4 pounds worth of plant. And that's pretty heavy. That is just because it is so saturated with water right now. Of course, that weight is going to vary. But just make sure if you're hanging these, you hang them from something that can definitely take the weight. You know, don't use a hook that's going to fall down. And we use hooks that can bear 25 pounds, and then we can hang more than one off of them. The second thing we're going to show you here is our pump sprayer, which of course the links to all of these, if you're interested in buying any of this stuff, is going to be in the link description. Now we have our two orchids. The first orchid that we have that we just planted in my left hand, and the second orchid, you can see the difference. See the color is like a leather tandem color, and this is more like a sand color. That's because the orchid, that's this darker orchid here, was just watered. The sandy colored orchid that I'm going to water is pretty dry. And this has been sitting for a while, and there was a reason, by the way, that I am not just running it under the water. If I just run it under the water, I'm going to completely compress and saturate that moss way too quickly. And I'm going to find that it's going to shift around, and I don't want that. So with this sprayer, which I can control the flow and I make a nice mist, I'm just going to start misting. And the nice thing about these sprayers is that you don't have to put a lot of pressure into pumping them, and they spray for a long time. Look how the water streams down into that moss. It doesn't take much effort. You can see it's looking from kind of sawdust type. Again, we're not using that thick water to compress it, but look at that sawdust type is making way to look like a nice thick kind of mushy rice texture, which is what the moss should be like when it's nice and saturated. And you can see that it's permeating and it's going down slowly but surely. It's getting through everything, because this is really an amazing substance, this spag moss, if you guys buy it. And if you do use this stuff, let us know in the comments on these videos how it works, or ask us questions. You have to make sure though, again, you don't want to have the moss too close to your stem and your crown. If you get water in the crown, take it out with a little Q-tip. And if you get water and too much water and the stem gets soaked, you're going to get stem rot, which is something that most people don't even know. Well, not most, some people don't even know it exists, but we definitely want to make sure that we use our finger, gently press down, and give it a lot of room around the stem and the crown to grow. We don't have any kind of shoots, any kind of new growth, any kind of air roots to get broken off, or basically mildew, molded, and saturated with water too much, because they don't like that, of course. And you can see right there, it hangs to one side. This is just the natural nature of orchids and the way that we have designed our pots, which is another video that you can always go and check out. So, I mean, that's really where we are and how to do these. They're very easy projects. This video was mainly done in one take, so you don't have to worry about spending a lot of time in transplanting these. And that's it. So if you like the videos, let us know. We appreciate you watching, liking, and sharing with everybody. And if you have any questions, it's carolinesorchids.com, and contact us on Facebook. And thanks a lot. Leave your feedback below. Bye-bye, guys.